I'm going to talk about this new breed or species of nervous tension or anxiety that I believe is abroad in the world because of the extent now of our online usage and the amount of time we spend online. It's taking the form of an essay I wrote a couple of years ago now, when it became evident to me that whenever writers gathered at literary festivals and at events, we talked about one thing only, which was the internet, and how the hell can we get away from it? Because if we don't, nobody is ever going to write a book again. So this piece is written in very short, numbered sections, and it's titled The Skin of Anxiety. 1. On a winter's afternoon, late in 1994, I sat with two friends in the attic of an old terraced house we were renting on French's Quay in Cork City. And we listened, rapt, to the gurgle and hiss of a dial-up internet connection inside a gigantic desktop computer. It sounded like a beast trying to take form in there, and we smiled excitedly through the brown fog of dope smoke. We were using the attic also to grow marijuana plants under lamps mounted in the eaves. Memory perhaps elaborates the picture, but I seem to remember that it took miles of cables, door stoppers of computer manuals, and weeks of hair-pulling complication to bring us to this moment. The connection hissed more loudly still and sputtered, and we held our breaths as the great network that we knew was out there tried to snag its digital hooks on the virgin nodes of Cork City. But it failed, and the room went silent, and we turned off the computer and got on with our lives. Which, in 1994, largely involved slithering bug-eyed around the walls of Sir Henry's nightclub until the small hours, sleeping until late afternoon, and then trying to lure passing college girls into the house with the promises of free dope, playtime with a cute black rabbit called Flopsy we had bought in a pet store on North Main Street, and we lied, access to the web. I was 25 years old, and at this time operating fitfully and at a very stoned level as a freelance reviewer, writing up notices of gigs and plays for magazines and newspapers. I would bash out my judgments on a Singer electric typewriter, perched on a wardrobe laid on its side to function as a desk. Sentences of Joycean complexity would be employed to tear strips off a Franken Walters show at Nancy Spain's pub, or the latest Corkadorka play at the Triskel. The Singer typewriter, quite snazzily, had an eraser function. Tipex was history, and the eraser was essential for the obsessive redrafting of my killer intros. I recall a sub-editor at the Irish Times asking whether a notice on some Cork indie band at the Phoenix Bar really merited an opening sentence that came in at something like 196 words. I would carry my typed pages as though they were tablets of stone across the river from French's Quay to what was then Jury's Hotel, where the receptionist would fax them through to Dublin, £1 the first page, 50p thereafter. Sometime towards the end of that winter, just before we all moved to London, we did finally get the internet connected, at least to some primeval degree. I don't remember exactly what I saw when I gazed for the first time into that fateful portal, or what I expected to see. But I do recall the first thing we did on the internet was look for a recipe for ecstasy. 2. The early autumn of 2012, and I tend to wake a little bit before 8 o'clock in the morning. And for a moment or two, I listen to what the weather is doing outside our house in South County Sligo. On 300 days of the year, it is raining hard, and I curse my fate. I then endure a moment of intense moral struggle. I know that I'm going to get up soon and spend the morning attempting to write fiction, as destiny says I must. And I know the last thing I should do now, because it will shatter my concentration before I even begin, is go online. But of course, I reach to the bedside table and grasp the iPhone. My wife tends to be awake a little before me, and she will already be tappity-tapping at her iPhone, even as I listen to the counterpoint of the rain's snare drum beat outside. And so my insinuation into the online world has begun even before I'm truly awake. I check my Gmail. I read bits of the papers. I Google myself. And yes, shame reddens my cheek as I type that phrase. I would almost rather admit to lying in the bed in the mornings abusing myself. But my suspicion is that almost all writers, young and old, now perform Google and Twitter searches for references to themselves several dozen times a day. I flutter about from site to site. I may well, as in I do, have a look to see how I'm getting on in terms of Amazon sales. So I will visit the UK, American and Canadian versions. I have even been known to visit the Japanese version because someone, a worried Mr. Murakami, bought a book of my stories out there once. I go back to Gmail and refresh my inbox to see if anything has come true in the last 5 minutes since I checked, though it's not yet 8 in the morning, but maybe somebody I know is up late in San Francisco and wants to make me fatally rich and world-renowned and has chosen just now to tell me about it. But I have no new messages. Zero. And another little knife is twisted in my nervous gut. I am not yet standing, or even fully conscious, but already I am in that impatient, flitty online mode. I bound about like one of those neurotic, petrol-sniffing hares you see at the Dublin Airport car park. I stay nowhere longer than a minute or two. If that, I'll start to read a piece, but 2 paragraphs in or less I'll go, yeah, right, blah-de-blah, and move on. You could not, by force of will, design a state of mind more unsuitable for getting up and attempting to make literature, but that, hilariously, is what I try to do. Or at least after a fashion. Lately, I note most of the essays and stories I write tend to be broken up into very short, numbered sections, because I can no longer replicate on the page the impression or sensation of consecutive, concentrated thought, because we don't really do that anymore. 3. Away with us now, friends, to a medieval scene. The town of Burr, County Offaly, as it was in the dreary winter of 1988, and an initiation ritual. I stood in an annex to a newspaper office that was in fact a shed with a galvanized tin roof, heated only by a Superstar heater. And a lady with a strong Midlands accent stood before me and she said, slowly and deliberately, "This is a mouse." She displayed the little attachment that trailed from a squat, square, green-screened Macintosh computer and smiled encouragingly. I was allowed to have a go. Worms of concentration wriggled across my brow as I tried to make the arrowed cursor on the screen move in response to my manipulation, but I was all elbows and knuckles, and the cursor skittered and sprang. "Go easy now," she said. "You'll get the hang of it soon enough." And within no more than a few hours, I really did have the knack of it, and I felt confidently immersed in the world of the new technology, as it was then known in the offices of local Irish newspapers. I was 19. I had just dropped out of college to take up a position as a cub reporter on a new weekly paper in Limerick City. A job in Limerick City in the late 80s was news in itself. And my college advisors had bid me haste as they urged me to quit the campus and go for it. It was the era when hot type scalpels and gum were giving way to desktop publishing, and my first task was to spend a week in Birr on a sister paper being schooled in the mysteries of the Macintosh. I was put up in a surprisingly plush hotel on the main street. I spent the winter evenings drinking to excess with members of the Midlands press fraternity. These were mostly of the generation excited into journalism by the Watergate scandal, but having found themselves writing about the pothole situation in Tullamore, they dulled the pain of anticlimax with booze. I recall one night returning to the hotel, having crossed the main street on all fours, and falling to a desperate sleep, and its sour, scary dreams of green screens, jittering type, electric mice. 4. How many times a day do I check my email? This is going to be very, very embarrassing. Frequently now you will hear people joking about obsessive-compulsive disorder. They'll say, oh, I'm borderline OCD. Well, I am not borderline OCD. I am deep in country. I am upriver and entrenched. I am the Colonel Kurtz of OCD land. I once had a workroom in a flat in Clontarf with a new beige carpet on which little hairballs would mysteriously gather overnight. Before I could begin to write each morning, it became a thing that I had to crawl around the floor and pick up every last one of the hairballs and count them. That's my kind of level. Last year, I spoke with 2 other Irish writers after a reading in Paris, and I asked them how many times a day, at an honest estimate, they checked their email. One of them, who was younger than me and much more connected, totted it up and blushed, and she said, oh, maybe 80? The other, older than me, and I would have thought much less connected, shook her head and scoffed, and she said, oh, at least 120, maybe 130. Me? I don't turn the internet off while I'm writing. I don't have the software that blocks it. So I'll check at least once every 5 minutes during the working morning. That's probably about 50 checks by lunchtime. In the afternoons, I gad about the Sligo Hills, often on my bike. But that doesn't stop me fishing out the iPhone, though granted the checking will be at the more relaxed pace of about a half a dozen times an hour. We're heading towards 90 email checks or so by tea time. In the evenings, I tend to check my email quite a lot because the US is about its working day and you never know what's going to come in from over there. We're back up to about 10 checks an hour. By bedtime, I have checked my Gmail, I would think at least 150 times. And this may be a conservative count. Now, on at least 140 of these occasions, my inbox will tell me that I have no new messages, 0. That's 140 tiny ego deaths I suffer each day. The effect of these is minuscule individually, but significant, I believe, cumulatively. Of the 10 or so mails I get a day, 2 or 3 will be spam offering me new tits, or a reliable erection, or investment opportunities in Lagos, and the rest will be dull and routine. I maybe get 1 or 2 mails a month of the type that I'm actually after. These are the emails that tell me I'm a wonderful writer of stories or scripts and there's money on the way. Each of these mails turns me into a more monstrous egomaniac, each to a tiny degree, maybe, but the effect, again, is cumulative. 5. Autumn 2003, the era of the digital quickening. I'm living in a basement flat in the new town of Edinburgh. My girlfriend is doing her PhD at the university there, and I'm attempting without landmark success to revivify the short story as a form. Most evenings, as dusk trails in from the Firth of Forth, carrying on its skirts a near Baltic chill, I go for a walk around the elegant Newtown streets. I can see down into the basement flats of the Georgian buildings. All the domestic scenes are lit and presented to the observer in a sequence of unfolding tableaux. I've lately been flabbergasted by a report that suggests people are now spending approximately as much time online as they spend watching television. But the evidence of this is clearly presented in the basement flats in the autumn of 2003. Typically, the scene shows a young couple. She is on the couch watching TV. He is at a slight remove, perhaps in an armchair or at a dining table, and staring into a biggish laptop computer, most likely a Dell. I'm back in Edinburgh frequently, maybe a couple of times a year. And by habit, I retrace in the evenings my old walks around the new town, and I look down into the basement apartments. The TVs have long since been switched off or have disappeared altogether, and both the he and the she have perched on their thighs the laptop, likely an Apple, and the smartphone, ditto, and they're not talking to each other. 6. Although I am online all of my waking hours, I am considered among friends and acquaintances to be an amusingly 1.0 kind of fellow, with throwback tendencies and Luddite markings. I am not on Facebook. I am not on Twitter. I do not have a website or a blog. I steer clear of iTunes, having wound up there once a bit pissed and buying about 50 quid's worth of Human League songs. I do not maintain a Tumblr or curate a Flickr account, and I'm unsure what words to apply to these things because I don't know exactly what they are or what they do. I check email, I read the papers, and I busy about looking at stuff. I've had an iPhone for a couple of years now and have downloaded no apps. A little flush of triumph comes to my cheek if I manage to email someone a photo or paste a link into the body of a mail. This, after 18 years of internet activity, is my level. I have never looked at porn on the internet, not having the need, as my mind already projects terrifying sequences of phantasmagorical sex images at all conscious hours of day and night. I have never played games online or arranged dates or sought to locate dogging venues in the vicinity of South County Sligo. I have lately bought turf online, but I do very little of the stuff you're supposed to do. Even so, I become extremely twitchy if force of circumstance keeps me away from the internet. My thoughts will stream then through the classic addict ruts. When can I next get a connection? Where can I find it? And how long will it take me to get there? 7. I'm now going to posit 2 extreme and contrary arguments, both of which I believe to be entirely true. A. Our complete immersion in the online world is largely benevolent. Loneliness has been vanquished by social media. Intense connectivity breeds a freshness of thinking. We open ourselves to new influences. We make brilliant new friends. We are exposed to the vast pools of human talent. We have immediate access to great film, music, literature, and to the artists behind the works. Education, healthcare, in fact, every area of civic governance can be streamlined potentially and made better, and these things are already happening in measurable ways. Rebellious political will can express itself with a furious immediacy. The opaque screen that covered the workings of officialdom has been shattered. Sexual emancipation is complete, and all of our tastes and peccadillos are revealed to be broadly democratic and can be satisfied at a click. Love is all around. Or B. Our complete immersion in the online world is largely malevolent. The leprous spread of social media does not represent a new connectivity or openness, but merely emphasizes and reinforces the epidemic levels of social isolation in our post-industrial world. Our constant online presence breeds a new timidity, a herd thinking in which we are afraid to stand apart from the crowd. Meek consensus quickly comes to dominate every conversation. Perhaps the most common phrase on Twitter is, agreed. Filmmakers, writers, and musicians are being economically raped by the expectation that if something is online, it must be free, with the consequence that, artistically and culturally, we are entering the era of the amateur and the part-timer. Our concentrational abilities have been shattered and they will never recover. The people's smartphones can be taken only from their cold, dead hands. There is no longer any real learning. The internet has made us also very prickly and paranoid. How long can someone take to respond to an email? And why? Because they're too busy fucking tweeting? Also, perverts are everywhere and they want to masturbate all over us. 8. I never thought I'd be nostalgic for internet cafes. Always those places, though, had about them a kind of tang of nostalgia anyway. They emerged just as the great waves of westward and northern migration swept over Europe in the mid to late 90s. Always they were filled with the homesick voices that whispered urgently on cut-rate phone lines in booths around the edges of the cafe. Voices nostalgic for Chad or Ukraine, and the rest of us tappity-tapped at the metered screens as we checked our Hotmail accounts and our friends reunited, our Bebo, our live journal, as we yahooed ourselves and sipped coffee from a percolator jug that tasted like it was brewed from crotch sweat and Bisto cubes. I have hauled myself away to Spain every winter for the last 12, 13 or 14 years. By late January, I can simply take no more of Ireland, and I run screaming from it for as many weeks or months as I can afford. By the early zeros, my desperation to locate an internet cafe as soon as I arrived in a Spanish city had become all the more intense and neurotic. I'd throw my bags into the pension or rented flat and immediately dash out to scour the back streets of Cordoba or Malaga or Cadiz until I found the @ symbol on the shop frontage, and then I could breathe easier again. I'd slink in and out of the cafes 3 or 4 or 5 times a day, and often late on, in the magic hours, with our faces lit by the glow of the screens, as the nights of the Spanish cities passed by outside, obliviously. And when I think of my old trips now, I think not of the great cathedrals, or the bustling alley life of the barrios, or the sweet wines, or the fried fish, or the beautiful people. I think about the internet cafes. 9. Visiting Limerick again, in the summer of 04 or 05, it seemed that half of my old friends were working at the Dell plant in Raheen. It was the high watermark of demand, and they couldn't ship the things fast enough. They simply couldn't get enough workers. Among the more idle types in Limerick, there was dark talk of the Dell bus. It would come through the estates at the crack of dawn, and the Dell people would jump off the bus and knock on windows and doors and try to yank innocent citizens out of their beds and onto the factory line. 10. I emailed my old housemates, Seamus and Jean, from our days on French's Quay in Cork. They were both far more tech-savvy than I, and both ended up working at Digital Stuff. And so I asked them for their memories of our first internet connection, which would doubtlessly be more precise than mine. Apparently, we used to look mainly at alt.dot newsgroups, and usually those that focused on cannabis cultivation in damp climates. The news groups had a very basic interface, dull, greyish blocks of rolling text lines. Our computer was a Gateway 200 PC, specifically a 486 SS33 with 2 megabyte RAM and a 100 megabyte hard drive. The modem, brought in from Holland, ran at 14k per second, which was too fast for Telecom Éireann's fledgling network, which ran at 9.6k per second. This was the snag that fucked up our access for most of the winter. Our primitive connection was eventually made by hitching onto some local ladies' network in Cork. We didn't have a browser, as it would be recognised now, but a green screen app through which you could perform basic hypertext linking. Seamus went to the Telecom Éireann office on the South Mall and asked about setting up an ISP, and he was told the best thing he could do was immigrate. Which we all promptly did. I allegedly threw the black rabbit Flopsy down the stairs one morning when I woke up with it sitting on my pillow. I do not recall this and I deny it. We apparently did find a recipe for ecstasy, but the next problem was locating the ingredients. 11. The scene, now, late at night, at the house in County Sligo. By the side of the bed, there are typically 20 or 30 books. Also, there are copies of magazines and literary journals. I am reading none of these. I'm lying in the bed tapping at my iPhone. It is a rare occurrence for me now to finish a book. I search for reasons to stop reading rather than reasons to continue. I flit and hop from book to book in precisely the way my brain has been trained to flit and hop from site to site. I have been neurologically rewired. Also, a very dark discovery. If contemporary books have some tiny hope of being read all the way through, I believe that many of the classics have none at all. If you've been online all day, their pace just seems altogether glacial. They seem kind of ridiculous. Mortified by one of those enormous blind spots in my reading, I had a go last winter at Madame Bovary. And it took me 3 weeks to get through about 60 pages of the horrible thing before I flung it across the room. It just wouldn't move in the way I expect a narrative to move now. I fear that I will never be able to read such books again, and I fear I am not alone in this, that I am typical of the current multitude, and the coming multitudes will be even worse. They won't even try to read such books, and all of the classics will fade away and will disappear. 12. But weirdly, towards the end of writing this piece, I visited friends who live in the dusty, dry, lizard-coloured hills south of Athens in Greece. They do not have an internet connection. I decided against the expense of allowing my iPhone to roam, so I spent just over 4 days entirely offline, which I believe is as long as I've been offline in more than a decade. And you know, it wasn't so bad. In fact, internet addiction, I believe, turns out to be very similar to cannabis or marijuana addiction. For the first day or two without, you are a little bit irked and vaguely impatient and susceptible to a kind of why bother with anything ennui. But there is no physical withdrawal. There are no sweats and there is no shaking. And after a while, you pretty much forget about it and get on with your life. I now strongly believe that internet use might in fact have quite a lot in common with marijuana use. The occasional blast is fine and might even be revelatory. But too much of it makes you a bit touchy and stupid. And you really shouldn't be doing it all day, every day. And you really, really don't need to wake and bake. Is it conceivable that a more casual approach might even become the norm? A few months ago, I talked to some very cool art students, early 20s, and we talked about the internet and its effects. And it appears that the hip thing now for arty kids in their early 20s is to go offline. They spoke happily of closing their Facebook accounts and giving up Twitter. The internet, they suggested, has become a bit of a dad thing. They seem to be much less excited about it than my own generation is. It was as boring to them as television was to me when I was in my 20s. I just wasn't arsed about it. It was what middle-aged people did. And I wonder now if the coming multitudes might not be so bad after all. 13. Or what if it's a skin of anxiety that's pulled tautly across the entire surface of the world, over all the hills and undulations, and what if it has changed everything forever and for the worse, and what if we can never, ever escape from it? Thank you very much. Cheers.